Hey, welcome to video lecture 2 of 2 for week 6 in the course Anthropology 3101, Foundations in Cultural Anthropology. Hope you're doing well. And this is going to be a brief presentation, again, material to help you augment the reading of the assigned chapters or excerpts from week 6. So here we go. We are going to start with Ronaldo Rizaldo. And you have an excerpt from a book that he wrote, and it's pretty interesting. I'm excited to see what you guys think about it. The focus is Grief and the Headhunter's Rage, from a book called Culture and Truth. And he was a Chicano anthropologist, and he's a poet. He wrote a book with 12 high school students in Arizona called The Chasers. So anthropology, ethnography, just one of the things he does, like many of us in the field. He's married to a feminist anthropologist, Michelle Rizaldo, and he was looking at earlier in his career headhunting, the practice of headhunting among the Ilongot in the Philippines. So the question is why, and hopefully the reading will help clarify that. If you look in the map on the left side here, there's the Philippines, and some of you know it's made up of many islands. Over 7,000 islands make up the country of the Philippines. And in his section or chapter called Grief and the Headhunter's Rage, he talks about the force of emotion, and he encourages anthropologists to take possession and forefront their own emotion when they do analysis of culture-based material. So he was grieving his wife, Michelle, and you'll read about what happened. And this grief, this taking possession of his emotions, led to insight and understanding of headhunting. So moving on to the next slide. Oh, maybe it's good here to make a little plug. So there is a film, and for the last 40 minutes, I've been trying to dig it up in my Google Drive. I know I have it, but for some reason, the Google Drive is not cooperating at this moment. There's a film, it's an hour long, and it's called Bontoc Eulogy. That's Bontoc Eulogy, Eulogy, Bontoc Eulogy. That film is an option for you to watch and write about. It directly relates to the Philippines, especially this issue of reflexivity and colonialism. And it's a really fascinating film if you haven't seen it. It's an hour long. And if things go well, when I post this video on week 6 Canvas page, I'll put next to the video lecture number 2 the link. I hope I can find it because I know it's in the library, but it's old school DVD. I'll put a link to the film Bontoc Eulogy. So the option you have for this week is to not read any of the material. Of course, read it. It's pretty cool stuff. But you can review this film. Usually it's a paragraph describing some specifics, some direct quotes, and then some analysis in paragraph 2. Usually, I don't know, 2 to 400 pages, 2 to 400 words, not pages. That would be a dissertation. So again, hopefully I can find the link, and if not, it's in the library. If you have an hour to check it out, watch it. Pretty cool. It's very profound and appropriate to this course and this week. All right, Ronaldo Rizaldo, in this book, Culture and Truth, it's a unique mix of ethnographic storytelling, critical rereadings of theoretical and anthropological text, and autobiographic revelation. His concern was that we forge new languages for speaking and writing about culture, languages that are intimate and compassionate and aware of mutually interrogating gazes. Back to this first sentence, a mix of ethnographic storytelling, critical rereadings of theoretical and anthropological text, and autobiographic revelation. I like that sentence. I read it twice because in a way, from like a micro point of view, your final projects can include that. storytelling, in other words, pulling out a story that you craft based on your experiences doing interviews. It could be a story about what you learn, some introspection. It could be a story about one of your interviewees that they told you, so retelling of their story. It could also be sharing with us what went wrong and or right with you in the collection of material through the interview process. And then, of course, a critical rereading of theoretical and anthropological text. That could be rereading Clifford Geertz's interpretation of culture, or it could be looking at Rosaldo's force of emotion as something that could be theorized and interrogated. And then, of course, autobiographic revelation. When you think of your final project, and this may sound strange, the final project is actually more about you than the interviewees. It's about your interpretation of their work, but it's also about maybe something you learned about yourself doing this kind of work, or a new revelation based on the topic that you selected, and something that is like a new understanding based on your conversations with these two interviewees. But we'll move on to the next slide. So he was Rosaldo, born in 1941, if I can see correctly. Yeah, 1941. Excuse me. Of Mexican descent, completed a PhD at Harvard in 1971. He did extensive field research among the Ilongots of northern Luzon in the Philippines. The book, Culture and Truth, emphasized process and history as opposed to structural analysis. It was the only book within anthropology at the time that spoke directly to the changing sensibility of the time. So around the time he wrote this book, he recognized things were going on in the world that were influencing the context and the landscape in which he was collecting ethnographic data. You had the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and you had the expansion of global capitalism. The fourth bullet point here, Renato advocated the importance of the indigenous perspective on the ethnographer's own culture and the ethnographer's work. So it's a pretty significant development. And it's funny how like white people necessarily didn't do this, but mostly people of color, scholars who are from the non-dominant culture in our field. The last bullet point in bold. So things that classical anthropology taught us to suppress, like emotion, social commitment, political engagement, are now the bedrock of the discipline as a result of Rosaldo's work. Be positioned subjects, not detached observers, was one of his claims to fame for us in the field of anthropology. When you do research, again, to generalize, those who maybe look at anthropology as a science would go into a cultural setting and be detached, and they'd observe, standing on this claim of objectivity. And he says, no, be positioned, take possession of your baggage and get involved and integrated and think about emotion, theorize social commitment, and be engaged along political lines. So pretty significant, and he's a hero in anthropology for a lot of his contributions. So his approach. So unfortunately, he experienced in the field the tragic death of his wife, Michelle. He used the force of his emotions associated with grief due to his wife's death to understand headhunting among the Ilongot. He experienced for himself the rage in grief, which when you read the section by Rosaldo, the explanation of headhunting largely relates to the grief that people feel in this culture from others who've been lost in their culture through headhunting. And so the personal experience of losing his wife helped him have a greater understanding of this process and practice of headhunting. He argues that social analysis depends on multidimensional knowing, feelings as a source of insight. So, in other words, like I said, grabbing onto the emotions you experience in the field and using them for their analytical power to help make some sense of what's going on and applying different anthropological approaches and notions. The bottom three bullet points, there's the emphasis on the role of improvisation. Life is what happens when you're making other plans. Crisscrossing of ethnographic and literary analysis. So here's another example of like a different style of writing that was more along literary lines, which for some people is liberating and not as like dense and difficult to get through like previous scholars. And then lastly, there's this insistence that one's heart must be in one's work for the work to matter. And this is actually important because when you are developing your topic or identifying, selecting your topic for the final project, you should find a topic that stems from your heart. In other words, it moves you, you're jazzed about it. It's something you care about because you'll have, excuse me, you'll have that much of a better time working on it if you really, really enjoy it. I'm very fortunate. I have about 5 or 6 ongoing projects and I absolutely love what I'm doing, even though I am getting old very fast because it's a lot of work. But I just really enjoy what I'm doing. And I think when you find the enjoyment, it pays off over the long term. So we have this notion of the dual project of ethnography. So what Rosaldo does is he writes about the fieldwork encounter. So the fieldwork encounter is, for example, you and your final project having that interview conversation. That's fieldwork. That's an encounter. So he looks at that as an encounter as a way to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So the goal is to humanize and familiarize the other. That means that interviewee, that study participant, this other individual in this community that you may not be a part of, but you're there to learn about. So Rosaldo uses his own experience of grief. Remember, he tragically loses his wife. This grief, he uses it as a vehicle for making the quality and intensity of the rage in Ilongot grief more readily accessible to readers. And then what you want to do, if you are jazzed by his approach, is defamiliarize our own culture and look at ethnography as cultural critique, as a process of, for example, learning about your own interviewees in this project, but then turning it on your own self and critiquing your own culture or the larger culture which you are a part of. And then, of course, this notion of reflexivity as defined by Marcus and Fisher and put into practice by Rosaldo, the sophisticated reflection by the anthropologist about herself and her own society that describing an alien culture engenders. Something to think about. And then also his work, Rosaldo, is kind of the genre of postmodernism. And there's some questions, but it's important to just recognize kind of on the border. But there's a couple bullet points. This notion of positionality, looking at borderlands, conflict and disunity, deconstructing, critiquing the embeddedness of our colonial past, the importance of ethnography as method and process. There's this constructivist approach that all truths are merely matters of agreement or merely constructions. Strongly questioned the anthropological project, forced close examination of many assumptions. So these are things that he put into practice, and so they fall into what's normally understood as postmodernism. The bottom here is Rosaldo. He did this application of interpretive analysis that was actually started by Boas with his introduction of this concept of historical particularism, which is kind of laser focused on individual cultures and their long history in order for us to grasp who they are. And of course, then Clifford Geertz developed interpretive anthropology more fully in his book, Interpretation of Cultures. So then I'm going to move on, and these are just quick slides for the other readings. You have Laila Abu-Lughod, and this is now, we're getting into some anthropologists who are currently living. And so they operate their own websites. And so this professor is from Columbia. There's a website that you can check out. So you can see there's a lot of media that anthropologists are engaged in, whether it's podcasts or films or presentations. So you can learn a lot about people's work. So Lila, against writing against culture, her work, you have this chapter, she talked about wholes and halfies in the context of her descriptions about Palestinian Americans. She does some analysis of the self and the other. In other words, she puts herself into the analysis. And then she also kind of brings up in a critical way the non-Western and Western bifurcation. And she talks about the ethnography of the particular. So again, if you read this excerpt from her work and you like her use of this phrase, the ethnography of the particular, you would again write about what exactly she mentions and then try to apply it in your own project. And you can say, being influenced by this professor and her term ethnography of particular, in my case, I'm going to apply it to this topic, and blah, 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 you go on and on and on. So for her, the question is, do Muslim women really need saving? And you'll find more of this in the discussion that is provided with the reading. And then, of course, she looks at culture as property of the other. And then she breaks it down into discourse and practice, connections, and of course, this term I mentioned before, ethnography of the particular. She's a really great writer and brings up some really fascinating issues with her analysis. So I hope you enjoy the reading. And two things that come up when you do go through her material. Bullet point number one, she, oh my gosh. She discussed the relationship between cultural forms and power, the politics of knowledge and representation, and the dynamics of gender and the question of women's rights in the Middle East, which has historically been a really hot topic in anthropology because of how Americans look at that part of the world and our general kind of distaste for certain practices of women in that world. And there's a great author, Edward Said, that we're going to talk about soon, I believe next week, that goes into great detail about some of these issues with his notion of Orientalism. But another key thing with this author, she's a feminist anthropologist. Her book, Writing Women's Worlds, she used individual stories to make a larger argument about writing against culture, writing against typifications of social structure and cultural form by attending to the internal argument, individual lives, and complex social dynamics. She looks at that, in other words, the phrase writing against culture as a means of intervening in vexed discourses about a maligned region, as well as challenging transnational feminist representations of women in Arab societies. I encourage you to not only check out the reading, but plug her website in, maybe watch a presentation or two. Really, really cool stuff. And a lot of these debates and discussion are still active in 2023. Now, the last reading by Rosabelle Boswell, she did some work in the Seychelles, and this is stories from the Indian Ocean Islands on the east coast of Africa. She talks about heritage and preservation. The context, which she writes about, is post-slavery. She's a poet, so she integrates a little bit more artistic ways of representing the cultural information that she collected, and encourages others to think of alternative ways than just standard essay writing to relay knowledge and get information out there. So there's juxtaposition of stories in the raw with sensory interpretation. So in other words, what does it feel like to be a part of this society or that society, or to experience some kind of social phenomenon? And she has a website there. You can read more about her work. And I'm interested to see what you think about her work in that excerpt that you have. And that, my friends, is the end of my presentation. I'm going to leave you with these takeaways from this, at least video number 2 of 2, that personal experiences enrich rather than diminish ethnographic understanding. What that means is when you do your work, in this course, it's going to be difficult. You're going to have ups and downs, and try to isolate, identify those experiences, and then use them to get analytical weight or to get mileage out of them with your interpretations of, like, for example, interviews. So in other words, it's okay to apply the emotional kind of stuff that goes on and put it in your analysis. Another takeaway: certain knowledges are only attainable through embodied experiences, and that's related to the most recent author and the Boswell reading, and that there's no objective position. The interpretation is the key. So in other words, if you think, and you could subscribe to this and you won't get dinged, but if you think you go into interviews on some topic and you want to position yourself as being objective with this week's module and the readings, people look at that as like BS, because we all have baggage and certain ways of looking at the world that it's almost impossible to be objective or quote unquote neutral. And then lastly, there's no wider representativeness and not super generalizable in terms of the work we do as anthropologists, which for some people could be weak, but for others is like, this is a natural kind of finding from the postmodern movement, which is what has shaped a lot of the work you are going to experience with these readings from these authors in week 6. All right, I'm done. I'm tired. Thanks everyone for watching, and I look forward to your write-ups. Feel free to reach out, and hope you enjoy week 6 of fall semester 2023.